From the Lean Enterprise Institute in Boston, this is the WLEI podcast, where we share stories of people making the world better through lean thinking and practice. For more information about LEI, including how we can help you apply lean thinking, please visit lean.org.
Welcome to the WLEI podcast. I'm your host, Matt Savis with the Lean Enterprise Institute. Ever wondered why some companies thrive through change while others crumble? Our guest, Dr. Lynn Kelley, has plenty of insights to offer. Following a distinguished career in engineering, supply chain, and continuous improvement, Dr. Kelley retired from Union Pacific Railroad in 2018. She's now a senior advisor at BBH Capital Partners, aiding in investment processes and oversight. At Union Pacific, she held the position of senior vice president and was integral to the company's innovation program and introducing lean management. Prior to this, she served an executive role as Vice President of Operational Excellence at Textron. In this episode, we talk about her new book, Change Questions, which she authored with John Shook. The book is all about how to manage organizational change successfully. We dive into the book's key lessons and how leaders can leverage them to increase their odds at successful transformation. Today, we have a very special guest with us, someone who has delved deep into the intricacies of organizational change. She's the author of a new book, Change Questions, a playbook for effective and lasting organizational change. With her wealth of experience and insights, she's here to share her knowledge and stories that I'm sure will resonate with many of you. And with that, I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Lynn Kelley to the WLEI podcast. Lynn, it's a pleasure to have you here with us today.
Thank you, Matt. It's so great to be here with you.
So, Lynn, I had a chance to read the book. It's a fabulous book. And before we kind of dive into that particular topic, I want to learn a little bit more about you, or at least get your audience to know a little bit about you. So can you share with us a bit about your journey with organizational change? What got you interested in the subject?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I think my first exposure was to Dr. Deming in undergrad. And I started my my undergrad late. I was 28 years old with two young children at home. But we were exposed to Dr. Deming and his 14 points. And I was like, wow, this is very cool. And I started reading all of his books. And then in my MBA program, it was a lockstep, and we were in Detroit, and there were 60 people, and half of them were from automotive. And so in the summer between the 2 years, we went to Toyota for 3 weeks in Japan. And this was in the late 80s or the early 90s. So there wasn't a lot of exposure then. And I saw it firsthand, and I was just like, wow. And I remember we were on one of the walks above the factory floor, and we saw an employee have a problem with a piece of equipment, and the brake bell rang, and everybody went to break, and he stayed. And then a guy came back and helped him. And all of the Ford, GM, and Chrysler guys standing around me all said, we will never compete with that. And it was just, game changing. Wow. So I was actually running a small community hospital at that point in time, a little tiny hospital in Detroit, Michigan. And I decided to apply that in healthcare. That was my first foray into it. And we ended up being written in a book as the first hospital, and maybe even the first service industry that had applied what was then, quality circles, and that it was more of a Deming approach, but it was Toyota. But the name lean wasn't as popular, but had applied that in healthcare. And then quickly, just so I'll talk my early stuff. And then I ended up getting a PhD in evaluation and research, and did my dissertation in statistics because Deming was a statistician. And then I did a postdoc at the Census Bureau because Deming worked at the Census Bureau. I mean, you can see how crazy guru, like I was just a follower, I was just so crazy about all of this. But when I became a professor, I did some consulting, and lean was just coming into the automotive industry, and a tier 1 supplier in Michigan that had 12 factories came to me and said, we understand this lean stuff. We've got 12 factories in Michigan. Can you help us develop an approach? Because Ford, GM, and Chrysler are now asking for it, and we don't know what to do. So we did a very much boots on the ground, 5S, problem solving, basic 5 whys. And a year later, their results were so tremendous that they won the Michigan Quality Leadership Award, which was all about lean. And then Textron, who owns Bell Helicopter, Cessna, bought that company based on that award. And then they came to me and said, hey, what you did in Michigan, we've got fastening companies in France and Germany. Will you go over there and teach them what you did? And
Mm.
this whole lean approach. And that got me started. Then I left academia and went into manufacturing, worked for Textron, and ended up being responsible for continuous improvement throughout the whole company at the holding company level. Eventually, after working through various business units, had a couple of international transfers, and then went to Union Pacific Railroad, which is the case study in the book, where we really translated lean for a railroad, which in the operating department was 42,000 employees, never under a roof, except the roof of a cab of a locomotive, in 23 different states. So yeah, that's kind of it in a nutshell.
The book is organized into a series of kind of philosophical questions that are aligned around what LEI refers to as the lean transformation framework, not directly tied to it, but very much related to it. And when I think about organizational change, what you often hear is something like a rollout or kind of a push from top management. And the way you frame your book is quite different from that. And I'm curious about why lead with questions.
Well, so John Shook was involved in the book and trying to figure out, did we want it to be questions or more of a framework?
Mm,
But so there's his story, which I can relate if you'd like in a minute, how he came to that, and then there's mine. But for me, what happened was, I especially when I was overseas working as an American, as a female in heavy industry. I was in the mining industry in South
mm,
Africa for a while. It was hard for me to get buy-in into change. And a lot
mm,
of what I was doing was lean, but some other different types of changes too, some supply chain stuff, just different things, but mostly lean, Six Sigma lean. And and so every time I failed, I would research what should I have done differently? What does the research say about this? And I was researching not just pure change management, but like a lot of peer-reviewed stuff that you find in, peer-reviewed journals done by,
mm,
professors or PhDs with really looking at a broader scale of what things work, what's the psychology around change. And
mm,
what I realized was, and of all of the methodologies that are out there in the frameworks and the models for change, and they're all really good, but all of them are a set of steps. And when I look at those steps, in order to make it not too cumbersome, they're like maybe 6 steps or 5 steps. But when you look at the research, they would say, well, 16% of change fails because of this. And it wouldn't be in a step because it was smaller than maybe the big things like
mm,
communications and leadership, but it would still be significant. And as you start working on sustainment, these things may be appropriate in your situation. And so then I just for myself created what I called a change playbook. It was digital because I was working remotely and internationally and
mm,
in 32 different countries. And it was a series of, I called them considerations. So I would say, okay, have we considered infrastructure? How are people being measured? Are we
mm,
going to roll out this change and find out their measurement system works against it? So what are all these other things besides the biggies? And the biggies are in there too. So I used it more as considerations with teams, and we would do this together through a digital playbook, and we fill out the questions or more the considerations, the ones that are applicable. So that's how I came to be using what I did. And then John's influence, actually, between the two of us, we realized what we really want are questions.
hmm. Well, I don't know if you intended this or not, but as I was reading the book, I almost saw it I saw it as almost like a coach. So it felt like you were, as the author, were kind of coaching me through uh, change management. And so it wasn't you telling me what to do, but things I needed to think deeply about across different dimensions, starting with purpose, then actually improving the work, developing people, the management system. I mean, you offer a series of guiding questions and actually, a lot of rigorous like frameworks, and you have quite a few templates and tools to help people out. But I don't know, was that the intention to sort of be a kind of coach as you were authoring the book?
You know what? You are the first person that noticed that. And yes, it was the intention.
Okay.
And I wanted it to feel like we were sitting together.
Mm,
And that's why there's not one solution. That's like
yeah.
we go and John Shook was a big proponent of, we're not offering a solution. We are
Mm,
offering possibilities. We want people to engage in the questions, think about how it applies for them. They don't have to do it in the order given. They don't have to do every question. They don't have to do the things we did at Union Pacific. And that's why we offer lots of different options to ways to answer every question. Almost every question has more than one option of ways to answer it too, as
mm,
examples of ways that we did it. And there were many more, but we had to pare them down in terms of examples. But we really wanted it to be not a step by step, you have to do this, but
yeah.
more of a, we want to engage you in thinking. I'm so glad you noticed. That makes
I,
me so happy.
it's exactly what it felt like. I mean, it
Good.
was prompting a lot of thinking as I was reading the book. I mean, I hope readers will spend more time thinking about the book than they do reading the book, because you'll get a lot out of the questions that you're offering. And I am curious, on the cover, you've mentioned his name a few times, John Shook, former CEO of the Lean Enterprise Institute. He's authored part of the book and you collaborated on writing it. And, that's really John's approach to things. He's not there to provide an answer. You can spend time with John for days,
Right.
weeks, waiting for him to tell you what to do. He'll never actually do it, but
He
he'll offer a
won't.
lot of opportunities for rigorous thinking, which can be
Yeah,
very frustrating at times, but in the end does yield uh, a lot of insights, thought that you would never have had otherwise, and leads to better outcomes. And probably most importantly, you feel like you own whatever it is that comes out of it. And
you're
I'm
right.
curious, what was John's influence on shaping the book, or how did you collaborate to reach this kind of format?
Yeah, yeah, it was an amazing experience, and as you
Mm,
you said, it was, I think, frustrating for both of us at times, and we both compromised, and we grew, and we talked, and
yeah.
thought and thought and thought. But what happened was, I was on the board of LEI for a while, and we were we had a call, and John was, of course, chair of the board and for a while, and so John and I had a call during COVID, and we ended up about board stuff. And then at the end, I said, "So what are you doing during COVID?" And he said, "I'm writing a book." I said, "I'm writing a book." And I said, "What's your book on?" He said, "Change." I said, "No, my book's on change." And then what we said is, why don't we be writing partners? We're clearly not going to write the same
Mm,
book because he's writing the Lean Transformation Framework. I'm writing the Change Playbook. But we said, let's write a chapter a month, send it to each other, talk about it, and then uh, take each other's input and go ahead and massage. And we
mm,
knew that we could trust each other, that we wouldn't be stealing from each other. And then, but oh my gosh, within 2 months, I mapped out the lean transformation framework and the change questions. And there was an 85-90% overlap between the two of them.
mm,
And what he was missing, I had, and what I was missing, he had. And we said, wow, this is this, this, if you combine them, it really fills in some gaps. And it's really robust now. I mean, it's even more robust. And so we decided that we would write the book. We have very different writing voices. He uses big words
mm,
that I have to look up in the dictionary. He's like so smart, and he makes me think like so deeply, and I'm kind of shallow in common sense. So I ended up writing the book with the Union Pacific plus the Union Pacific case study. That was 8 years of my life in Union
mm,
Pacific with all the stories. And so that was clearly had to be my voice. But but every time we wrote a chapter, he would come back and say, "What about this one?" And made me think. And
mm,
that's, and like you said, you really, when you're working with John, I mean, this is 1,000 times better book than it would have been if
mm,
I would have just written it on my own. And it took longer. It took time, but the richness of what there is now is amazing. And then what he ended up doing is at the end of every chapter, he brought in more of a global view,
mm,
more of a his life's view about that particular change question topic. And so it's just, it's really rich. And what I found is people have favorites. Like people will read it and go, "Oh, I couldn't wait at the end of every chapter to get to John's voice, to hear his take on all this." Or people will say, "Oh, I couldn't wait to hear what happened next at Union Pacific." It's kind of like, I'm so glad we did it together. It was fun.
We'll get back to the podcast in just a moment. Are you struggling to unlock the full potential of lean thinking in your organization? Then join us at the 2024 Lean Summit in Carlsbad, California on March 19th and 20th. Dive deep into the transformative power of lean and immerse yourself in inspiring keynotes and interactive learning sessions. This year's theme, Shaping Tomorrow, Developing People, offers game-changing insights and actionable strategies for today's toughest business challenges. And here's a special tip for our listeners. Register now and save $600 with the Ultra Early Bird discount. Don't miss out on this opportunity to expand your expertise and connect with the Lean community. Learn more at lean.org/summit. See you there. Now, back to the podcast. Well, we've mentioned the Lean Transformation Framework a few times, and it's probably worth kind of sharing with the audience the 5 questions that shape it. The first is around, what is the value-driven purpose of the organization? And then the pillars, it's shaped as a house. Check it out on lean.org. But it's what is the work to be done to achieve the value-driven purpose? How do you support the people, develop the people to improve the work to achieve the value-driven purpose? And then what's the management system, leader behaviors, infrastructure, as you referred to it earlier, that supports all of that? And then finally, the foundation, what are the underlying assumptions that support all of this, or culture, as most people refer to it, including you as in your book. But you go through those in a sequence, starting with defining the purpose. What is the purpose of change? And I feel like you encounter a lot of organizations. It's often skipped, that part. It's change for change's sake. Why do you want to become a lean enterprise? Well, to become a lean enterprise, why do organizations often skip that step? Or I guess the better question is, why is it important to even answer that question?
Oh, that's such a good question. And let me full disclosure here. So when I first encountered the Lean Transformation Framework,
Mm,
what I realized I didn't have purpose in mine,
mm,
because I had come to the my thought was, well, your purpose. If you've
mm,
defined your change that has to take place, your purpose. And then I went right into, but what we have to define is, what value
mm,
will this change deliver? So what I found with John's input of how important purpose was, I came to realize, especially as I look back, and you'll hear some of the a little bit of the failure that I had by not, like, overtly defining purpose, is that you risk misalignment. You risk the
mm.
fact that your team may not even be aligned,
Yeah.
and the team that's implementing the change, and the buy-in from leadership to say, this is what we really want, or when they define it, then it gives a clear understanding to the whole organization of the true north. People use that term also, but just why are we doing this? What is the problem we're trying to solve? And so that's what this starts with. And sometimes, I mean, if you already know, you just write it down. If you don't know, or you define it, right? If you don't know, that's a good stopping place to say, wait a minute,
Mm,
we need to do this. And then with the change questions, then what we've put also under purpose is, then we do the very like a secondary step of, well, why are we doing, like, what's the value we're going to get from this? And
mm,
because later on we're going to measure it, because one of the examples we give is, people say, well, we want to put in a new billing system. Well, if you put it in because you want the billers to increase the customer satisfaction, or not billers, I'm sorry, but like, maybe decrease the time or the errors and bills, or whatever that you're doing it, what's the value that you want to get? Later on in the change questions, we ask you, are you really getting the value? And what sometimes people will say is, well, we've trained 500 people. Well, yeah, but
right.
let's go back to what that value is supposed
We've
to
done
be. Was
1,000
the
Kaizen
value
events or something.
trained people, right?
Mm,
So it keeps you honest. those two together are a really nice combination.
Well, something that also struck me, and you were so thoughtful about how you go about assessing whether or not change is happening, including in that very first step of defining the purpose. You even have an approach to sort of measuring whether or not the team is aligned around
Yeah.
the purpose, because so often, and I'm guilty of this, you're in the meeting and, hey, this is the new direction, this is what we're going to be doing, and you say, okay, yeah, I'm on board, but are you really on board? I don't really know. I actually don't
Yeah.
fully understand what we're agreeing to right now, but
Yeah.
I kind of want to get out of this meeting. But
So I
you have
just
a
say yes.
you have a clever way of
Mhm.
assessing whether or not the team is even aligned, which I would think is, hugely important before going out rolling out some big change initiative. Can you describe how you do that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it was especially important in the Union Pacific. So I
Mm,
mean, what happened is I came in from the outside. These are all term railroaders. Who's going to listen to me? I'm
right.
reporting directly to the CEO. Don't know anybody. And I've got to build a team that's going to implement what we ended up calling Union UP Way or Union Pacific Way. The abbreviation for Union Pacific is UP. So
Mm,
UP Way, we're going to have to implement this to the operating department, 42,000 people. I don't even know who to bring on my team. And then it turned
mm,
out I wasn't really given a choice because the operating department is divided into these different departments. There's dispatch, there's engineering, there's mechanical. I need transportation. I need somebody from each of those
mm,
areas. So I asked them who like I asked them to volunteer, give me a person, right?
mhm.
And so it turned out no one on the team knew what lean was.
Yeah.
And nobody knew what we were doing. And everybody thought it was flavor of the month. And everybody thought, I don't
Mm,
have time for this. So basically the whole process is simply GRIPI, GRPI, it's goals, roles, process, interpersonal. You can Google it, but I describe it in the book. There's basically, you can find questions online. I just used SurveyMonkey to create an anonymous tool where do people understand the roles, the goal, which is the purpose, their role, GR roles, process, what's our
process.
process to get stuff done, and the interpersonal, do we have a good relationship as a team? And so I would send that out after every meeting and then come back in anonymous. The answers would come back and I just show the graph and you could see if we were aligned or not. And then just say, okay, goals, 5 of us are aligned, 6 of us aren't. Okay, what's our goal? We wrote it in purpose, but is there something missing, or interpersonal, or what's our process to have a meeting? So we were able to work through all that. And that's what helped us really coalesce as a team.
Yeah, and with each step along the way, you were so methodical about assessing whether or not you were heading in the right direction. And there's a point in the book, I was pretty struck by this, where you say that I guess research indicates within 30 days of the start of a
Yep.
transformation effort, you'll know whether or
Yep.
not it's going to succeed or fail. So
Yes.
you better know where you're at within those first 30 days. How can companies do that? How can you assess where you're at so that
Yeah.
you know whether or not you're heading in the right direction?
Yeah. It's very clear. When I read that research years ago,
Mm,
it was like, oh my gosh.
mm,
So it's good news, though. It's good news because why wait 6 months down the road? You
right.
can tweak it. You can look at it as a big experiment,
Mm,
right? So one of the change questions is how can we detect failure? And that is, I'm paraphrasing, but underneath one of the change questions, how can we get an early detection of failure? And so what I really believe in is we put all this effort into planning the actual change and like what is it we're going to do, what are we going to change, and not as much effort into saying, okay, now what do we need to do to be
mm,
able to launch this or introduce it or so that it will sustain? And so part of the change questions is ask you to plan how you're going to introduce the change. And one of those things is how will you detect this early failure? And it really does. And we could see like rolling it out in often we had 15 sites at a time. I had 15 people on the team, sometimes as many as 20, but that's all I had. So we were limited, and they were all geographically diverse, but we get to see where some of them were gaining traction and some of them weren't. And so we would immediately go in, but you can do it a lot of different ways. Do we have time? Do you want me to share with you a quick way we
Sure,
did it?
yeah, please.
Okay,
Yeah, I'd
okay.
love
It's in the book, but I can do it real quickly. We wanted part of in leadership, one of the biggest failure modes, and we all know this is, lack of visible, proactive leadership support. That's always in every
right.
research. That and communications always are the top one or two. So we decided that we were going to define leadership behaviors, and we also elicited feedback from leadership. What do you think? How could you show visible leadership support? So one of the things we came to say is leadership will train their employees in like 5S, and we would support them in that training. So what we did is we put in a survey as soon as 4-question survey, soon as they finished the course that the leader had given. The questions were things like, do you think this will increase employee engagement? Do you think that it will increase operating results or customer sat? Do you understand like the concept 5S? So do you understand 5S? And do you think you're going to use it? Right. So those are the questions we asked within, depending on time. And we couldn't always get 4 weeks, but because we were just so busy, but between 3 to 6 weeks after the training, we sent another anonymous survey to every person that had the training with that manager and asked them those same 4 questions. But now we said, has it increased employee engagement? Has it increased your customer sat, productivity, operating results, whatever it was? Have you used it? And then there was the other one, which I can't forget. I don't have them. I don't have them in front of me. But anyway, we basically said, are you doing it? And then the managers knew they were going to get that survey. So then they did start using it right away, but we could detect where they didn't. And then we could go out and say, okay, this is not by employee, but look, 80% of your people said they haven't used 5S. So let's talk about this. And we could come out and it said course correction and accountability and just the feedback and from the employees. Right. So it was really that's kind of one of my go-to ones. I like to do that if I can.
Well, it was so interesting because along the way, you always are tracking not just the performance metrics, which is what most organizations track, but also the underlying process metrics that are behind it. Or I guess maybe not process metrics, but more like behavioral metrics. You somehow
Yes.
managed to quantify whether or not people were doing the things that we had set out to influence them to do, but in a way that wasn't like autocratic. You're not just telling people what to do. You're trying to steer them in the right direction. And I thought that was really clever because it allowed, I would think, your team to also iterate on the change management process. You're getting the feedback. It's not just a tool to say, hey, why aren't you teaching your team how to do 5S? It's an opportunity for your team to go, hey, what are we doing to influence this leader? It goes both ways.
That's so good. You're right. And then the other thing we could do, we could highlight successes. And another one of the change questions is, how do you recognize success early on? Early on, you want to, Malcolm Gladwell, the tipping point, you got to build positive momentum.
Yeah.
So we would see like the ones that are really going crazy with it, and we'd go visit and we'd have an interview, or we'd have them present to leadership, or we'd have the CEO mention, and then we could also pair those really good ones with some that were not doing so well. And so, because we had limited resources, and we could let them mentor and partner with each other. So it created, you have the data. The data is so rich. It creates all kinds of opportunities to springboard off that. One effort, one activity gives you so many ways to multiply the message and also to create synergies and relationships that can help support the whole activity.
Well, speaking of that, trying to get early wins point, there's this principle that you refer to pretty regularly as part of kind of two. It's improving the work and people engagement, people development. It's this 20-60-20 principle, which I will forever use, because it's not just useful, but I don't know,
Yeah.
provides a little personal reinforcement when things aren't quite going the way you would hope they would go. So the idea
Yeah.
is when implementing change, 20% of the people are going to naturally resist, sort of the default for them. 60% will be neutral, just kind of hang out, see which way the wind is blowing over time, and they'll eventually follow. And then 20 people who are just natural sort of change agents, curious, willing to learn, try new things. And you talk about the importance of identifying those groups of people and doing what you can to find those change agents, those 20 who are naturally curious and willing to try new things. Can you share more about why that's important and how people might be able to actually do that?
Yeah, and let me first say, it's not just like a pop curve like 20-60-20, like somebody
Mm,
just came up with it. It has been researched over the years in really rigorous research to find out, is this really, how the normal curve is kind of a natural
hmm
curve that appears in nature. And there are certain things that kind of naturally occur. And this has has become really well researched and is really robust. It's never 100% time's going to be like that. But once you understand it and know that it's pretty significant, and then start thinking about what you're implementing, your transformation around it, it's powerful. You can
mm,
you can leverage it. So the whole idea is you've got to get enough for the tipping point. You've got to get enough to build positive momentum in any given group. If you roll out a transformation like peanut butter, like every, you announce it and then everybody gets it at the same time, you got to think about that neutral group is who I need. Who has
mm,
the loudest voice to influence them? It's going to be the resistors. So, what do I need to do to influence them positively early on? Now, you're going to get to the resistors, and I don't like that name. I tried to think of another one like those that are slow to change. It's like he who must not be named. There's too many words involved. I couldn't think of a better name for resistors, maybe. But people, and there's a lot of research too that people that generally are naturally inclined to resist change
mm,
um, are often coming from a pure place of really wondering, is this best for the organization? And it's dangerous to name them only as resistors. But I'm going to take the shortcut now. We're going to call them resistors. You understand that I believe there is a method and a strategy
mm,
to deal with that group, and it can help you in so many ways refine your initiative. But early on, implementing change, lean transformation, anything in a group, my belief is that you start by identifying change agents and then you start your experiments there. And you've already built in, I'm going to recognize these folks. They are going to
mm,
be, every success will be publicized. Everybody's going to look, oh, now look at their results, and everybody's talking about them. And then those neutrals that are just there, it's self-interest. It makes sense to be neutral.
right.
Okay, I'm just waiting. If it's going to add value, I'm going to do it. If it's not, I'm not. I'm going to be conserve my energy. Why jump at every new thing, right? Every shiny object. It makes sense to be neutral too. So the people that are neutral start getting their interest, and then they want to come over there, and pretty soon you've got enough for momentum, and then you can turn your attention, and then you can really do some really nice refinements with the people that naturally resist change, because they may have concerns other people just sweep under
Mm,
the rug. And then everybody knows in this world that when you get one of those folks on your side, when you flip them, they
yeah,
are your best
yeah.
person to have. Then you get them up in front of everybody and they tell their story, and it's so powerful. But I don't believe you can start with them. I think you're setting yourself up for a much harder
Yeah.
path if you do that.
Yeah, I think John once said, "Feed the hungry babies first," or something like this. Yeah, to try to build
He didn't
momentum
say
and
that to me, but I love it. That's great.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, you talked a little bit early on about leader behavior, but it's not just leader behavior that you talk about in the book. Like the Lean Transformation Framework, it combines leader behavior with the management system.
Right.
And you mentioned that story about being in the Toyota factory with the folks from Chrysler and one of the other automotive companies and observing uh, a Toyota supervisor or manager going to the floor at a lunch break to understand why a problem happened. I presume that was not an accident. That was not a coincidence that you happened to observe an especially good Toyota leader investigate a problem soon after it happened. There was a system in place that prompted that person to take that action. And it wasn't the heroic act of an individual who was especially empathetic or knowledgeable about this particular problem. But can you talk about that, the balance, the relationship between the management system and leader behavior? Because I think a lot of people are are waiting for leaders to just change,
Right.
and so are leaders. They're just waiting for the people
Yeah.
waiting for them to change to also change. But what's there? There has to be a system. There has to be something governing people's behavior. Um,
Right.
can you share what's your take on the relationship between those two things?
Yeah. We made it very defined
Mm,
what leadership, what the role would be at UP way, right? I mean, you're talking again, I hesitate. And what I say again and again in the book is if you have a very simple change, if you're moving one piece of equipment in
yeah.
a factory floor, this is going to be overkill for you. You don't need all this. That's why I change questions. You answer the ones that are appropriate. But if you're doing, 42,000 employees, 23 states, no, not under a factory, never see a supervisor, maybe every 6 weeks,
Yeah.
is very complex. You've got to be much more thoughtful about what leadership behaviors are there to be
Mm,
expected. And so we did give it a lot of thought. We did catchball. Many of you are familiar with catchball. We went to some leaders and said, how do you define the leadership of behaviors that will support? And keep in mind, nobody knew what lean was. I mean, we had
mm,
one person, one department in the company doing lean in one location. I mean, and they were kind of separate from everybody else. Nobody in transportation knew
yeah.
what lean was even, they never even heard of it.
Mm,
So there was a lot of education, a lot of catchball in that to be able to let people understand where we're heading, and then asking them, the leaders, so how could you show visible support of that? And then ultimately asking them, now, will you do that? Will you show visible leadership
mm,
behaviors? And then there were some things that rolled down from the top, like leader standard work, started at the very, very top of Union
mm,
Pacific with the CEO and the COO, and then went out to all the leaders sequentially over a course of about a year and a half,
mm,
so that, it was really taking hold. It wasn't just we're going to do this tomorrow and everybody's going to do it. It cascaded throughout the organization. And then the blend of that, part of your question was a blend with the management system, was also looking at the things that are in place
mm,
at a company like Union Pacific. And for every different change, you will have to look at that management system. And now again, before I started calling it management system, which is what lean transformation has named it, I called it infrastructure, because how I discovered it was with a study that said, now I forgot the percentage, but a certain percentage of people want to do the change, but the actual infrastructure and the metrics, the reporting relationships, the all of that fights against them doing it. They may have been trained and they may have been given the IT support or whatever they need, the tools they need, but everything else fights against it. And so the idea is to stand back for your change. If it's a new ERP system, it's going to be different than a lean transformation. It's going to be, but you look at all those things and you say, what will fight against it? And if a leader is the champion of it, sometimes you're starting at the workplace and they want to do the transformation,
mm.
and then you've got to convince leadership. And other times the leader wants it, and then you've got to convince them. It depends on where the idea comes from. But wherever it comes from, you start with that evaluation and ask the questions, and then it's catchball, because both groups have to be involved in it.
Well, there was an interesting story about conflicting metrics. I think it was between
Yes.
the terminal and dispatch. Dwell
Mhm.
time
Absolutely.
was
Yeah, good for
was
you.
bad for the organization, but terminals metrics were green. Dispatchers metrics were green, but
Yep.
trains were just sitting all over the train yard. And one of your team
Right.
members noticed that and said, this something's wrong here. We can't be green when all these trains are piling up.
Right.
But how do you give that person she didn't have authority in that situation,
Right.
but she understood there was a problem and worked with that group to resolve it at
That's right.
system level. But how does a person like how do you give somebody I guess the confidence to do that, the capability to do that?
Yeah.
I mean, what's behind somebody being able to do something like that?
And now I love this question because I'm sitting here thinking, yeah, how do you do that? And I think if it's me, I always lead with data, right? So because
Mm,
that's my background, right? You don't have a PhD in evaluation or research and not lead with data. I mean, it's just my go-to. I just do research and I lead with data. So, and I think that was Rebecca in the book. We had to change all the names in there. I'll get
mm,
confused in my little brain. But basically, what this person was seeing was when she would go out, to the terminal, she'd see
mm,
trains sitting everywhere. And then she'd look at the metric that dispatch has on their IT and their computer system, and it would show they were green on theirs, the terminal's green,
yeah,
and everybody was optimizing their own metric because
yeah,
the terminal was their wait time was their dwell time was what was once it got into the terminal, and
mm,
they were trying to optimize that and push stuff out to the edges, and the dispatchers had to were responsible for every train before it got or after it got in the terminal. So you've got
right,
them fighting against each other. And so then going back to purpose, so the way Rebecca did, I think it was Rebecca did it, was to say, well, what's the purpose, and went up to leadership and with data that shows, look, we got these they're fighting against each other. They're
right,
optimizing their own, but they're making the problem worse and for the whole railroad. So then they put them in pairs. So their metric was no longer to be the pair of the terminal. So every
mm,
single geographic area had one person in dispatch that was, can't think of air traffic controllers dispatching everything until it got into the terminal. Then you had the one person physically in the terminal and paired them up and said, what's your purpose? Well, the purpose is dwell time. No matter where it is, you got to decrease dwell time. And that's how they were able to get a lot of good things out of that.
yeah. It's amazing what can happen when authority comes from facts versus position inside of an
Yes.
organization. And
Yeah.
if leadership is willing to defer to facts,
Mm.
how that can influence an organization. I thought that was a really, really cool story inside the book.
Okay.
Um, how do you envision organizations? What's your ideal scenario for how organizations use the materials?
Well, so when John and I, defined our purpose, we said, what's our purpose in writing the book? We said, we want to get this into as many hands as possible. So it's
Mm,
not, the purpose wasn't to make money. Purpose wasn't to sell books. Part of the way to get it into many hands is to sell books, right?
hmm
But the purpose was to get it in as many hands as possible. So what we decided to do, and we had a lot of talk about how are we going to do this. So since I had always used a digital version of the Lean Transformation Framework that John used, and John did not use a
mm,
digital version, we decided that the book would be the case studies and the stories and the blend of the two. And then on the website, we would put the change questions into now a PDF, a much better digital. Mine was a goofy Excel file with every tab being a different question, but we put in a really a nice looking PDF with examples and let people fill it out. And that way we can get it into as many hands as possible. If they don't have the book and they want to buy it because they need more stories or more research or whatever, they can. But if they just want to use it, or if somebody has the book and is leading a team and then they want all their team members to have the digital workbook, they can just use it. You can go in right now and start answering the
mm,
change questions, and you can use it with your team, and you can. And then what I always loved about the digital version is when you're ready to talk to leadership, you've got something physical you can take with you or
mm,
send to them if it's remote, and it shows how you got there. It doesn't, it shows the path. It's it's a document, and it shows all of the different, you can say, oh, I want to talk to you about the leadership behaviors, but if you want to see how we got here, look at purpose, look at design, do and improve the work, look at the engage and then develop employees, look at all those other areas, look at culture. This is how we got to where we got. And it has a place for decisions, to record decisions. So, and for team action items. So it's just really, it's really we think it's a grab and go kind of thing that you could start using right away if you'd like to. And that is the piece that so far we've got 4 to 5 universities that have signed up. They want to use that as student projects in graduate schools. And and every university we're talking to has either said, yes, we're going to use it and we're going to use it this fall or this winter, or we got to find a place to use this. So, the goal of getting into as many hands as possible, it's really taking off, and we've now kind of cut off how many universities we can handle this round. We want to make sure we learn from that experience and make it really, really good for all the universities that are signing up. And we'll probably end up with 6 or 7 that will actually do this year. And some of them are offering like 3 sessions of the course. So it's going to be hundreds of people that will then, and a lot of them are in graduate programs. So they'll be probably using it. So that's what we really want. We want people to use it.
My last question, Lynn, is, tough. I don't know if it's a tough question, easy question, but if there's one takeaway you'd want somebody to have from the book, what would that be?
Yeah. It's not worth putting all the planning. You can have the best idea, the best lean idea. You can have the best ERP idea. You can have the best whatever, perfect solution or idea. It's not worth doing it if people don't buy into it. Or so you take the time up front. It's consider the upfront time part of the time of the idea. You take the time up front. If the change questions work for you, you answer those. If not, you use another kind of change approach, but you think about, how am I going to engage the employees? How am I going to evaluate the context where the change is taking place, and make sure at every site or at every location that it's going to be applicable? How am I going to record early successes? Where can I pilot it? What's my management system? What's the culture of this organization? How can I leverage culture to be able to springboard this, but also how can I mitigate the risk from the culture that, and you plan ahead of time. How can I detect early failure? All of that. It takes some work, but honestly, every time you do it, it gets easier. And then you get your go-to tools, like the go-to things you do. Like I said, I usually like to put a little 4-question survey in every class, and then 4 weeks later, survey them again. And then once you have your little ways to do things, it just pays dividends. It is so worth it. That's my one big takeaway, I think.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us here, Lynn, on the podcast. And I hope everybody goes out and buys your book. In the meantime, check it out. You can go download the workbook at changequestions.net. Thanks, Lynn.
Thank you, Matt.
I'd like to thank Lynn for joining us on the podcast. If you're interested in checking out the book Change Questions, head over to changequestions.net, where you can order it as well as download the free digital workbook. And thank you for listening.